One of my favourite tools in the shop is my trusty biscuit jointer. I've already done a video about tuning up a biscuit jointer to make sure it's actually cutting accurate slots, because if it's not, it's completely useless. So if you haven't already watched that, and if you haven't checked yours, go and watch that video. But I thought I'd just give you a few really quick beginner kind of tips for using a biscuit jointer, because it is a really useful tool to have in the shop. So first of all, if at all possible, use dust extraction with it. It's changed my life since I've worked out that my Festool hose fits into that connector. I was using the bag all the time before. It's a tool that it makes a massive difference having dust extraction, because otherwise every time you turn it upside down, all the dust falls out the bag and into your slot that you've just made. So in this example here, I've just got this piece of MDF and I want to attach this piece on the end. And just adding a couple of biscuits, it helps with alignment and it makes the joint a lot stronger as well. So what I like to do with a joint like this is clamp a piece of wood onto the end of the bench, and I'm going to use that both as an alignment piece and as a marking block as well. And I've marked on this piece of wood here where I want the biscuits to go, because this is going to go on like that. So I need, and this is another little tip for you, so I've lined that edge up, just mark a line down so that it's obvious that we're going into this edge and not this edge. Okay, it sounds really obvious, but when you're batching this up and you're doing a lot of them, it's very easy to just take your biscuit jointer out and accidentally do them into the face of that and the end of that, for example, if you're doing loads and loads of cuts. So I find a good way just to avoid that is on the edge where you're doing the face cut. So this would be your edge cut, that's your face cut. So just mark it so you don't accidentally go into the wrong end. So all I'm doing, I'm lining up perfectly to the edge of that. I've marked where the biscuits are going. I'm going to do one here and one here. I did just use, where's it gone? I did just use a square to set that distance to be the same at both sides. Obviously it's not particularly critical, but I like to do that, and it just means that well, I just think it's good practice to keep it the same on both ends. And all I've done, I've put a mark on there and a mark on there, and I've transferred that mark onto this piece of wood, because once I'm doing the biscuit joint, I'm not going to be able to see these marks anymore, because the biscuit joint is going to be on like that. Which takes me on to another tip. And that is knowing which is your reference edge. This is really important, because with a biscuit jointer, you can either reference off the bottom or you can reference off the fence. And I generally, if possible, prefer to reference off the bottom, but there are situations where you have to reference off the fence. The key thing is that you're referencing off the same thing on both pieces of wood. If not, your joint will be out. So on this, my reference edge here is going to be this bottom. So I'm just going to put a mark there. It's obvious that the reference edge here is going to be the bottom. You'll see why in a minute. But on this piece of wood, the reference edge is this side, because we want this to be perfectly in line with the edge of that. Okay, so that means if the bottom of the biscuit jointer is lining up that way against that edge, then the bottom of the biscuit jointer on this cut has to go against this edge, which means it's going to have to be this way round. That's why I've already transferred some markings onto the flip side of the bit of wood. And if you use the same distance from both sides, like I've done, then it doesn't matter which way round you put this piece when it comes to fitting it, you see? Whereas if you just pick a random place, you're only going to be able to put that one way round. So all your usual safety rules apply, safety glasses on, and we want to make sure that it's perfectly butted up against this piece. And once it is, it's a good idea to clamp it in position. I'm also making sure that it's perfectly flush on that edge as well. You've got leeway with biscuits, you've got a bit tolerance, so you don't have to worry too much. But I am going to just pop a clamp there just to stop it from shifting. And I'm going to do all of these cuts and you'll see how relatively quick this is. Dust. So I'm pushing up against that edge and I'm making sure that this is perfectly flat on the table. I've got my biscuit size set to a number 20 biscuit that I'm using. And just because you might not be able to see, I'm lining up that red line with the mark that I put on the piece of wood. Then for these endy bits, I've already marked this piece. I'm going to just carry these markings over onto this piece. For these edge bits, so I now need to go into this edge. The way I like to do it, I've just made myself a little board. I'll find it. And I'll just clamp that onto my bench. Or you can put a ridge on that edge, which I did have, and I've lost my ridge. This board needs to be nice and flat, and not covered in dust. Reference edge down for this. Reference edge down. Just one little safety tip, really. The biscuit joint is a relatively safe tool because it retracts inside its own thing because it's got the spring-loaded retraction mechanism on it. So generally, as tools go, you know, unless you make a really sustained effort to shove your fingers in that gap or something goes really horribly wrong, you'll probably be all right. But you'll notice when I'm doing my cuts, I try not to keep my hand in front of the jointer. I try not to do them like that, just in case some, you know, worst case scenario, maybe it like flips up and shoots forward and the blade goes into my hand before it gets a chance to retract back inside. So I try, when I'm holding the piece down, I try not to hold it like that. I try to hold it, same for this cut here, you'll see when I did it, rather than having my hand like that, I try to keep my hand slightly over like that, or like that, whichever way you've got the best hold of the piece, just so if anything does go wrong and, like, you know, it slips or something like that, it just minimises any chance of anything kind of, because it will happily rip your hands off. You know, you've got a blade spinning at a, how many revs? 10,000 RPM, that blade's going, it's very, very sharp. It'll happily take fingers off, no problem whatsoever. It's just a common sense thing, really. Try not to keep your hand in front, try to keep it to a side. And then when it comes to actual assembly of the joint, grab your biscuits. So I'm using number 20 biscuits here. I need 2 for that side and 2 for the other side. Get your glue. I'm just using Titebond 2, seems to do the job. Put a good squish to your joint. And I like to glue the whole joint. And you can fill the other side of your joint up with glue and do it that way. I'm just doing it this way. There's many ways to do this, you know. But what I do like to do is just use a paintbrush to fully coat the other side of the joint. And just make sure you've got plenty of glue on. Reference side to the bottom. Pop that on. That's it. We get a square. And I've raised this off the bench with a couple of blocks just so I can get the clamp in. There we go. Just grab a cloth and wipe off any excess glue, or you can sand it off later, whichever you prefer. Leave it overnight for the glue to dry, and that's it. Easy peasy. Make sure it's perfectly, if you're doing a joint like this, make sure it's perfectly square from the start, because you're not going to be able to shift it once the glue's dry. Trust us on that one. Couple of other little tips for you. If you want, what you can do, if you don't want to mark up your bit of wood at all, you can get away with not marking it at all if you're only putting one biscuit in each side. And what you can do is you can just use the edge of the biscuit jointer itself as your gauge for how far in the biscuit's going to go, if that makes sense. So you would line up on that edge, on that side, and you would line up on that edge, on that side. The only trouble is if you do it that way, you'll end up with the centre of the biscuit being about there. So if you imagine, so there's a number 20 biscuit, and that puts it about 4 centimetres from the edge of your piece of wood. Now I prefer the edge biscuits to be a little bit closer to the edge, about an inch or about 20 mil from the edge, 2 centimetres from the edge, and that just gives enough scope that it's close enough to the edge that if you're going to be sanding or cutting a fraction off the edge, you're not going to run into your biscuit, but it's going to keep the alignment of your edge really nice. If you're too far over, you might find that your edge goes out of alignment. So that's why I tend not to go off the edge of the biscuit jointer as a guide, but you can do that if you want. That is an option. With this particular biscuit jointer, if you're going to use the edge as a guide, you're going to end up with a number 20 being about 40 mil from the edge of your piece of wood. I prefer to have it about 20 mil, which works out at that. That would put the centre point, I think, at about 5 centimetres. 50 mil is my kind of where I would normally aim for. In terms of biscuit size, go for the biggest biscuits that you can get away with. I tend to always use 20s unless there's a reason for it. So unless I'm running into situations where a 20 is just going to be too big for that particular project. So I'll get through more of them than anything. In terms of your spacing of your biscuits, I like to go about 20 centimetres apart, 200 mil. So on this piece of wood, if I was going for a centre point here, so that would put a centre there, and as it happens, that's exactly 200 mil. That's a complete coincidence. What's the chances? Anyway, for something like that, I probably wouldn't bother with a middle one, but you could if you wanted. If for something like this where you've only got one at each end, you could optionally add a middle one in. I would say for anything under about 200, it's up to you whether or not you want to bother with that. Personally, I probably wouldn't. But generally, if you're doing a big board, I would do them on 200 centres. Obviously, if you want to get even spacing, you're going to have to work that out depending on your width of your board. But 200-ish, you should be champion with that. Here's another little quick one. I hardly ever adjust the height of the fence because generally I'm always doing 3/4 inch boards and stuff. But the key thing is, if you're going off the bottom edge, your height adjustment does nothing anyway. The height adjustment is only for if you're going off the fence. So since I almost always go off the bottom edge, and this is pretty much preset for 3/4 inch boards anyway, I think. If you do want to adjust the height that your biscuit's going into an object, then you're going to have to take your fence as being your reference edge, not the bottom edge. You can't adjust the height relative to the bottom. Here's another little tip for you. Let's imagine that you're attaching, imagine that's the full width of that board, and you're attaching that on like halfway up the board, so you're not at one end or the other. Well, here's a little tip. Just lie it flat and look. Let's just do a little marking first so we'll know where we're going to be jointing. So we're going to be jointing that edge and that edge. Where's our reference edge? So on this piece, it's that and on this piece it's that. So all you need to do is clamp that in place, put your markings wherever, and then if you use your biscuit jointer to go down, 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 that's automatically used that as the reference edge, which is correct. And then, without even moving the clamps, bring your biscuit jointer in and go bam, 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 and that's automatically used that as the reference edge. Really quick way, one set of clamping, and you can do 2 lots of your jointing in one go. And then final little tip specific to the DeWalt 682. Great little biscuit jointer once it's all tuned up and working properly. I'll just put a little piece of tape on here just to deflect the fan from blowing dust and wind straight into your face while you're cutting biscuits, because that is your kind of vent port, and it tends to just blow everything straight into your eyes while you're cutting. So I just shove a little bit of masking tape over there. It's not completely blocking it, it's just deflecting the air to make it come out at a bit of an angle that isn't directly into your eyeballs. I hope you found that useful. There's links in the description to this particular biscuit jointer, or a rough kind of equivalent one, depending on when you're watching this, if you're watching this in future time. Don't forget there's extra stuff over on my Patreon where you can get information about job pricing and all sorts of other stuff. Don't forget to hit subscribe, and I shall see you next time, you wonderful, wonderful people.